My dad chose my cruel stepmom over me for years. When I refused to invite her to my wedding, he tried to destroy my reputation. I never thought my relationship with my dad would end up like this. It's been a long, painful journey filled with betrayal, heartbreak, and a lot of hard lessons. I'm writing this not just to get it off my chest but also to hopefully find some peace and maybe, just maybe, help someone else who's going through something similar. To give you some background, I, 29F, was born to a wonderful, loving mother and a dad who, at the time, I thought hung the moon. My parents were my world, and for the first 10 years of my life, I was incredibly happy. But that all changed when my mom got sick. She was diagnosed with cancer, and within a year, she was gone. I was devastated, as any child would be, but what made it worse was the way my dad handled it, or rather, didn't handle it. After Mom died, it was like my dad shut down. He didn't know how to cope with his grief, and instead of being there for me, he threw himself into his work. I rarely saw him, and when I did, he was distant, almost like a stranger. I was so lonely during that time. I missed my mom terribly, and I missed the dad I used to know. About a year after Mom passed, Dad started dating again. I was shocked at how quickly he moved on, but I was also hopeful. Maybe this new woman would help bring my dad back to life. Maybe she would make him happy again, and we could be a family. Enter Susan. She was the complete opposite of my mom. Where my mom was warm, nurturing, and kind, Susan was cold, critical, and manipulative. She had 2 kids of her own from a previous marriage, twins who were the same age as me, and from the moment she moved in, it was clear that she favored her own children over me. At first, I tried to be understanding. I knew it couldn't be easy blending families, and I figured it would just take time for us to get used to each other. But as the months went by, it became clear that Susan had no intention of trying to bond with me. She made it obvious that she didn't want me around and that she saw me as a burden. She would do things like forget to set a place for me at the dinner table, leave me out of family outings, and make snide comments about how I was too sensitive or too much like my mother. I tried to talk to my dad about it, but he always brushed me off, saying I was overreacting or that Susan was just trying to adjust. Things got worse when Susan and Dad got married. Susan made it her mission to push me out of the picture completely. She started telling my dad that I was difficult and disrespectful, and that I needed to be disciplined. My dad, who was so desperate to keep Susan happy, started believing her. He started siding with her in every argument, no matter how ridiculous. For example, there was the time Susan grounded me for a month because I didn't do the dishes fast enough. When I tried to explain to my dad that it wasn't fair, he just told me to respect Susan's authority and do as I was told. It felt like I was losing my dad all over again, and I didn't know what to do. The final straw came when I was 16. Susan had planned a family vacation to Hawaii, something I had been looking forward to for months. I was so excited to finally spend some quality time with my dad and maybe even try to bond with Susan and her kids. But 2 days before the trip, Susan told me I wasn't going. She said they had miscalculated the cost and there wasn't enough money to pay for my ticket. I was crushed. I begged my dad to reconsider, but he just shrugged and said maybe I could come next time. There never was a next time. They went on that trip without me, and when they came back, it was like I didn't exist. They didn't bring me back any souvenirs, they didn't show me any pictures, they didn't even talk about the trip in front of me. It was like they wanted to pretend I wasn't part of their family. That was the moment I decided I couldn't do it anymore. I started distancing myself from my dad and Susan, spending as much time as I could at my friends' houses or at school activities. I threw myself into my studies, determined to get into a good college and get out of that toxic environment as soon as possible. I couldn't wait to leave for college, and when the day finally came, I left without looking back. Over the years, I stayed in touch with my dad, but our relationship was never the same. I'd call him on holidays or his birthday, and we'd exchange polite small talk, but there was no real connection. I couldn't trust him, not after he had chosen Susan over me time and time again. I tried to forgive him, but every time I thought about what I'd been through, all the anger and hurt would come flooding back. I focused on building my own life, working hard in college, and eventually landing a job that I loved. I made new friends, traveled, and did everything I could to put the past behind me. But no matter how much I tried to move on, there was always a part of me that longed for the relationship I used to have with my dad. I missed the closeness we once shared, and I often found myself wondering if there was anything I could have done differently to keep us from drifting apart. Fast forward to last year when I got engaged to my fiancé, Mike. Mike is an incredible man, kind, supportive, and everything I could have ever hoped for in a partner. When we started planning the wedding, I knew I wanted to keep it small and intimate, with only our closest friends and family. The idea of having Susan there, pretending to be the doting stepmother, made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't bear the thought of her being part of one of the most important days of my life after everything she had put me through. I talked to Mike about it, and he was completely supportive. He knew about my history with Susan and understood why I didn't want her at the wedding. So, I made the difficult decision to invite my dad but not Susan. I agonized over how to break the news to him, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I called my dad and told him about our wedding plans, and at first, he seemed genuinely happy for me. But when I told him that Susan wasn't invited, his tone changed immediately. "What do you mean Susan's not invited?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. I took a deep breath and explained. "Dad, you know how difficult things were between Susan and me growing up. I don't want any negativity on my wedding day, and I just don't feel comfortable having her there." He was silent for a moment, and then he exploded. "Are you kidding me? Susan is my wife. If you're not inviting her, then you're not inviting me either." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I held my ground. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Dad. I want you there, but I'm not going to compromise on this. This is my wedding, and I need to do what feels right for me." He hung up on me. I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling a mix of sadness and anger. I knew he'd be upset, but I didn't expect him to react like that. I thought maybe he'd come around, that he'd realize how important this was to me, but he didn't. Instead, he went on a campaign to destroy my reputation within our extended family. A few days after our conversation, I started getting calls from relatives, my aunts, uncles, and even some cousins, demanding to know why I was excluding Susan from the wedding. They said they had heard that I was being cruel and disrespectful to my father's wife, and they couldn't believe I would do something so hurtful. I was shocked. It turns out my dad had been calling everyone in the family, telling them that I was refusing to invite Susan out of spite, that I was trying to punish him for marrying her. He painted me as some kind of vindictive brat who was holding on to a grudge from the past. He even went so far as to tell people that I was trying to ruin the family by causing drama right before the wedding. I couldn't believe it. My own father was spreading lies about me, all because I didn't want his toxic wife at my wedding. I tried to explain my side of the story to my relatives, but most of them didn't want to hear it. They had already made up their minds based on what my dad told them. Some of them even said they wouldn't come to the wedding if Susan wasn't invited. It was devastating. I had always been close with my extended family, and now they were turning against me because of my dad's lies. I felt like I was losing everyone I cared about, and all because I wanted to protect myself from the woman who had made my life miserable for years. Mike was a rock during all of this. He supported me every step of the way, reminding me that this was our day and that we had the right to decide who we wanted to share it with. He even suggested we elope if things got too overwhelming, but I didn't want to give in. I wasn't going to let my dad and Susan ruin this for us. As the wedding day approached, I made peace with the fact that my dad wasn't going to be there. It hurt, but I realized that I couldn't control his actions. If he chose to side with Susan over his own daughter, that was his decision, not mine. I also accepted that some of my relatives might not come, and that was okay too. I wanted people at my wedding who loved and supported me, not those who were going to judge me based on lies. The day of the wedding arrived, and it was everything I had hoped for. Despite the drama, our friends and the family members who did attend made it a beautiful and joyful occasion. We had the ceremony outdoors, under a canopy of trees, with the sun shining down on us. As I walked down the aisle, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I was marrying the love of my life, surrounded by people who truly cared about us. For that moment, nothing else mattered. After the ceremony, we had a small reception with dinner, dancing, and lots of laughter. Everyone who was there was so happy for us, and I could feel the love and support in the room. I knew I had made the right decision by not inviting Susan, even if it meant losing my dad in the process. I felt free, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But the drama wasn't over yet. A few weeks after the wedding, I received a letter from my dad. It was long and filled with anger, accusing me of being ungrateful, selfish, and heartless. He said that by excluding Susan, I had disrespected him and dishonored our family. He went on and on about how much Susan had done for me over the years, citing all the times she sacrificed for me, like taking care of the household while I was growing up, which was laughable because she had done everything she could to push me out of the family. He ended the letter by saying that he was cutting me off completely. He said I was no longer welcome in his home and that he didn't want anything to do with me until I apologized to Susan and made amends. He also mentioned that he had updated his will to exclude me, leaving everything to Susan and her children instead. I was numb as I read the letter. I had expected him to be angry, but this felt like a betrayal on another level. My own father was disowning me, all because I stood up for myself and refused to let his cruel wife be part of my wedding. I showed the letter to Mike, and he was furious. He wanted to confront my dad, to tell him how wrong he was, but I told him not to bother. I knew it wouldn't change anything. My dad had made his choice, and I had to live with that. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't see the point. My dad had made it clear where he stood, and I wasn't going to beg for his love or approval anymore. I was done trying to win his favor, done trying to be the good daughter who just put up with whatever came her way. I had my own life now, and I was going to live it on my terms. In the months that followed, I focused on building my life with Mike. We bought a house, started planning for the future, and I threw myself into my work and hobbies. I cut off contact with the relatives who had taken my dad's side, choosing instead to surround myself with people who truly cared about me. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain and anger would resurface. I would find myself replaying conversations in my head, thinking about all the things I wished I had said, all the times I wished I had stood up for myself sooner. But I knew I couldn't dwell on the past. I had to keep moving forward, even if it meant leaving my dad and that part of my life behind. About a year after the wedding, I heard through the grapevine that my dad had been diagnosed with a serious illness. The news hit me hard. Despite everything, he was still my father, and I didn't want him to suffer. I wrestled with the idea of reaching out, of trying to mend things before it was too late, but I wasn't sure if I could open myself up to that pain again. Mike encouraged me to do what felt right for me, whether that was reaching out or maintaining my distance. He reminded me that I had nothing to prove to anyone, and that whatever decision I made, he would support me. In the end, I decided to write my dad a letter. I didn't apologize, but I did express my sadness over how things had turned out. I told him that I loved him and that I wished things could have been different. I also told him that I forgave him for everything, even though it had taken me a long time to get to that point. I sent the letter, not expecting a response, and I didn't get one. I don't know if he ever read it, or if he did, whether he cared. But writing it gave me a sense of closure. I had said what I needed to say, and that was enough for me. A few months later, my dad passed away. I found out through a relative who hadn't taken sides in the whole mess. I wasn't invited to the funeral, and I didn't ask to be. I knew Susan would be there, and I didn't want to cause any more drama. I mourned in my own way, surrounded by the people who mattered most to me. In the end, I didn't inherit anything from my dad, but that wasn't what hurt. What hurt was the realization that the man who was supposed to love and protect me had chosen someone else over me time and time again. But with that realization came a sense of peace, too. I knew now that I had done everything I could to try to make things work, and that the distance between us wasn't my fault. I've learned a lot from this experience, about boundaries, about self-respect, and about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who truly care about you. I'm stronger now, and I've built a life that I'm proud of, with a husband who loves and supports me unconditionally. If there's one thing I've taken away from all of this, it's that you can't control other people's actions, but you can control how you respond to them. And sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is walk away from toxic relationships, even if it means letting go of people you thought would be in your life forever. But the story didn't end there. After my dad's passing, I received another surprise, a letter from a lawyer representing Susan. She was contesting my father's will, claiming that I was still entitled to part of his estate, despite his wishes to cut me out. It was bizarre. Why would she try to include me in the inheritance after everything that had happened? I was skeptical, but I agreed to meet with the lawyer to find out more. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, I was met by a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor. He greeted me politely and handed me a file. Ms. Thompson, I understand this must be difficult, but there are some things you need to know about your father's estate. I nodded, trying to mask my confusion. I'm just not sure why Susan would want me to have anything. It doesn't make sense. The lawyer sighed. It's more complicated than that. Your father's original will, the one he created before he met Susan, was very clear in leaving everything to you. However, after he married Susan, he amended it to include her and her children. But what you don't know is that your father had a change of heart in the last few months of his life. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Your father came to see me shortly after receiving his diagnosis. He was gravely ill and knew his time was limited. He expressed deep regret over the way he had treated you and wanted to make amends. He instructed me to create a new will that would leave the majority of his estate to you, with a smaller portion going to Susan and her children. I was stunned. I had no idea my father had done this. But why didn't he tell me? Why did he leave it like this? The lawyer hesitated before speaking. He intended to, but he passed away before he could finalize the new will. As a result, the will that is currently in effect is the one that leaves everything to Susan. However, there are letters, emails, and other documents that clearly show his intent to change it back in your favor. Susan is aware of this and is contesting the will to acknowledge your father's wishes. My mind was racing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father had wanted to make things right, but it was too late. And now Susan, the woman who had caused me so much pain, was trying to honor his wishes by fighting for me to receive my inheritance. It was a twist I never saw coming. I didn't know what to feel: relief, anger, sadness, confusion. It was all a jumble of emotions. The lawyer went on to explain that the case could take months, possibly even years, to resolve. Susan's children were fighting her on this, as they believed they were entitled to the full estate, as per the current will. I left the lawyer's office feeling conflicted. On one hand, I was grateful that my father had tried to make amends, even if it was too late. On the other hand, I didn't want anything to do with Susan or her family, especially if it meant getting involved in a legal battle. When I got home, I talked it over with Mike. He was as shocked as I was, but supported whatever decision I made. If you want to fight for what's rightfully yours, I'll stand by you. But if you want to walk away from all of it, that's okay too. You don't owe anyone anything. I thought about it for a long time. I had been through so much pain because of my father and Susan, and the idea of getting drawn back into that world was exhausting. But at the same time, this was my father's final wish, and I felt a sense of obligation to honor it. In the end, I decided to fight for my inheritance, not out of greed, but because I wanted closure. I wanted to know that my father's intentions were recognized, even if it meant going up against Susan and her children. The legal battle was long and draining. There were depositions, court hearings, and endless paperwork. Susan's children fought tooth and nail to keep the estate, arguing that my father's original will was the only valid document. But Susan stood by me, providing evidence of my father's intent to change the will and testifying on my behalf. It was a surreal experience, being in court with a woman who had made my life so difficult. We exchanged few words outside of the legal proceedings, but I could tell that this was just as hard for her as it was for me. Despite our past, she was honoring my father's wishes, and for that, I was grateful. After nearly a year of legal wrangling, the judge ruled in my favor. My father's intent to change the will was deemed valid, and I was awarded the majority of his estate. It was a bittersweet victory. I had won, but it didn't bring me the closure I had hoped for. The money couldn't undo the years of pain, the lost relationship with my father, or the betrayal I felt. I used a portion of the inheritance to pay off the legal fees and then donated a significant amount to cancer research in my mother's name. It felt like the right thing to do, a way to honor her memory and give back. The rest, I put into savings and investments for my future and any children Mike and I might have. As for Susan, we parted ways after the legal battle was over. She thanked me for fighting for what was right and expressed her own regrets about how things had turned out between us. I didn't feel the need to forgive her or mend our relationship, but I also didn't hold on to the anger. It was time to move on, to leave the past where it belonged.